Manuel again. I'm David Flint, and we're discussing current matters. And we thought we might discuss two matters tonight. First, the Belt and Road Initiative, and then go on to restarting the economy. We can begin with the Belt and Road Initiative. As we know, the government of Victoria is entering into an agreement with the Chinese Communist government concerning the Belt and Road Initiative. And a lot of comment has come out about whether the government of Victoria should be doing this. Is this not a national matter? The point is that under our constitution, a small number of powers are exclusively given to Canberra. Defence, for example. But external affairs, that is, empowering the Parliament to make laws for the peace, order and good government of the Commonwealth with respect to external affairs, is a power, like many of the others, shared with the states. And there's another provision in the Constitution, section 109, which provides that if a Commonwealth law contradicts with a state law, then the Commonwealth law should prevail. And the case law of the High Court, the jurisprudence of the High Court has developed to such an extent that the judges try to find out from the facts whether there's an indication from the law that the Commonwealth is trying to occupy the field. If they're trying to occupy the field, that makes it very easy for them to find that state laws have to be stood down, avoid, because the Commonwealth law must prevail. Now, what is curious about the Belt and Road Initiative is that the Memorandum of Understanding was entered into in 2018 with almost no notice to the Commonwealth. And now they're entering into an agreement, they're working out the agreement. And the Commonwealth has never, although they've expressed dissatisfaction with this, they've never seriously tried to block this. And they could. They could introduce legislation, for example, requiring that any such agreement needs the approval of the Commonwealth. But they haven't done that, but they still object to what's happening. And one wonders how serious they are about stopping Victoria from entering into this agreement, which is causing us trouble. Already, the Secretary of State of the United States is indicating that America is not happy and may well cut off countries that get involved in Belt and Road initiatives. One of the matters which has not been discussed, and there's been little mention of it in the media, is that in 2017, the Turnbull government, that is the federal government, entered into a Memorandum of Understanding with the Beijing Communist government concerning a Belt and Road Initiative. As far as we know, it's never gone any further than that. However, the Turnbull government refused, when it was called on by the opposition and others, to release the Memorandum of Understanding. They refused on the grounds that they couldn't do that until Beijing agreed to its release. So we do have a peculiar situation concerning the Belt and Road Initiative, which is to bring countries much closer to Beijing, to bring them into the orbit of Beijing, which many people, and certainly I think, is most inappropriate for a free country in alliance with other free countries such as the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Great Britain, and the United States, of course. It's very strange that we should be getting involved with the communist government. Peter.
It's very, very worrying, David, what's going on, especially with this Belt and Road. And with the Memorandum of Understanding that the Turnbull government signed in 2017, I like the word secret Memorandum of Understanding. I think there is too much hidden from the people of Australia. As I keep saying many times, they are our employees. We're the employer, and there's too much being hidden from the Australian people. And what really worries me about this Belt and Road, for a start, we should not be jumping into bed with any communist regime, whether it be China or anybody else. And this is going to have huge ramifications on all Australia. And for what I understand, there's trillions of dollars going to be spent on infrastructure in Victoria, Chinese money. What happens if Victoria can't pay this money back? What happens, David?
Well, the precedence with other agreements under the Belt and Road Initiative is that the Beijing government doesn't give money. They're not like the Americans, who gave enormous amounts of money and aid and have continued to do that. The Beijing government lends money, and many of these countries, for example, Sri Lanka, have found themselves in a position where they cannot repay that money, and they then repay it through assets. For example, the handing over of a large port in Sri Lanka to the Beijing government. So Beijing accepts assets as a means of payment, as a method of payment of the very heavy debts. Many countries have found that as a result of this initiative, they've become very heavily indebted with the Beijing government. Now, I think we should not look at the Belt and Road Initiative alone. We should look at it in the context also of the famous free trade agreement which Mr. Andrew Robb negotiated on behalf of the Abbott government. And that was to enter into a free trade agreement with China, although it wasn't much of a free trade agreement. And the reason it wasn't much of a free trade agreement is that from the time of the Hawke government, Australian politicians became obsessed with the concept of free trade. There's nothing wrong with free trade. It's a very good idea, provided it is genuinely free and free on both sides. But so obsessed were Australian politicians that they decided that even if you unilaterally revoked your protection, that would be good for trade. And there are economists who argue that in a perfect world, even if one country just doesn't have any protection, it still does better, they say, because of free trade. Well, that's not the real world. And from the time of the Hawke government, we gradually lowered our tariff barriers without getting reciprocal undertakings, reciprocal arrangements for other governments, or if we got reciprocal arrangements, then finding that they found other reasons, health or safety or something like that, to block entry into their countries of goods they didn't want. And as we know, other Western countries notoriously have done this with agriculture. The Europeans, for example, and as well the Americans and Japanese in relation to certain forms of agriculture. It's the real world, and our politicians have negotiated as though there's not a real world. They've negotiated with this rather wide-eyed belief, at least this is what they're saying, in free trade, in the same way that they're doing the same thing in relation to what they described as climate change and used to be called global warming until the warming stopped. And they're doing the same thing. We're unilaterally doing things, and other countries are not doing them. We're the ones who are shooting ourselves in the foot. So when it came to negotiate the free trade agreement with China, there wasn't much for us to give. We'd already opened our doors. So what they did, well, the Chinese government said, well, we're going to let you into our country, at least they promised. What are you going to give us? And we said, well, what would you like? And they said, well, we want to we want to invest in your country. So what happened was the free trade agreement essentially says Chinese investment should be treated no differently from other investment into Australia. There's still restrictions, but it must not be treated differently. There's a terrible mistake there. Chinese investment I mean from the Chinese communist country, that investment is very different than, say, investment from Belgium or England or the United States, Canada, and so on. Because the corporations which invest in Australia from the People's Republic of China are under the direction and control of the government, the Beijing government. They are under the control of the Communist Party. They have branches of the Communist Party in their organization, officials of the Communist Party, and they do the bidding of their government in minute detail. And they're there really to advance the foreign policy of the People's Republic. So you're letting into Australia a very different entity than, say, a Belgian or a Dutch corporation buying some property in Australia. We've been treated very badly, and I think the politicians have completely mishandled our trade negotiations, not only our trade, but also investment arrangements in relation to the Chinese Communist government. Peter.
Yeah, I totally agree, David. I think, as we know, our politicians are letting us down in every way possible. But it was interesting in regards to Victoria, how they leased the port of Melbourne out to Chinese for 50 years. And then all of a sudden we hear now we've got this Belt and Road initiative. I just wonder whether the Northern Territory, where the Port of Darwin's been leased out for 99 years, whether they come on board with this Belt and Road. That would be one to really watch, I would think. But with this free trade agreement with China, as far as I'm concerned, they've torn it up. And I'll tell you why they've torn it up. Because all of a sudden now, because we want this investigation or this inquiry into this virus from Wuhan, China, they're not happy. So they're slapping this 80% tariffs on our barley and not taking meat from 4 processing plants in Victoria. So they've torn it up. And when our politicians signed this free trade agreement with China, why didn't they have a proviso in there to say, well, you're buying our water, you're buying our agricultural land, you're buying this, you're buying that of ours. For us to sign it, we need to be able to do the same to you. We need to be able to buy your water, your agricultural land, and so on. So our politicians have let this country down badly. And we talk about free trade. I like the word fair trade, because when we do dealings, when I do business, I believe in doing business fairly and always leave something in it for the next person. But with these free trade agreements, there's nothing left for the next person. And unfortunately, there's nothing left for Australia. And if we only have to have a look back over the last 50 years, David, with these agreements and treaties and everything like that, and we hear the words from politicians, we're moving forward. We're not moving forward. We're going backwards big time. And people know it. These politicians that get up, on national TV or go and do their little speeches around the place, people are not silly. They're getting sick of this. They can see this country going to rack and ruin, and it's only going to get worse. And we need big, big change, David. We really do. David?
Peter, I agree with you. Too many of the politicians are really in the Beijing lobby. And they've done very well out of it. Too many of the members of the political class, that is politicians, ex-politicians and the like. And they have received very interesting and very well-paid consultancies and directorships and so on. These are politicians, for example, who've retired from the federal parliament. They've retired on platinum-plated superannuation. Australian people are very generous in relation to our politicians. They don't live in poverty once they leave the parliament. Notwithstanding that, they seem to have accumulated very well-paid positions, quite often paid by corporations and others within the communist regime. And it's very hard to see, and you have to wonder whether they are really acting in the best interests of Australia. Now, that is a very bad thing, and that brings me, if I may, to restarting the economy. And there's a feeling in restarting the economy after, I think, the mismanagement of the economy by the governments, not only the federal and state governments in the national cabinet, is a call to restart. Just to remind viewers, Australia seems to have done well in relation to the virus. Well, so we should have. We're a remote island continent. The easiest, with New Zealand, the easiest country in the world to defend. So what happened was that much of the defence of this country came from our remoteness, but they mishandled much of the first 2 months by letting in people, both not only in the ports, not only with cruise liners, but also with airliners. People were let in without adequate controls. They did restrict people from China, but still people came in without adequate controls. And then they didn't necessarily look after the most vulnerable in the best way. And we saw that particularly in New South Wales in the nursing homes. We should have followed Taiwan, which follows world's best practice, but we didn't, and we have about over 15 times the number of deaths of Taiwan, and Taiwan has about the same population. We could have done much better. But the worst thing they did, I think, was the lockdown. The lockdown was brought in, obviously, because they were influenced by this computer modelling from the Imperial College in London, and that has been exaggerated. They were talking about up to 150,000 being killed by the virus. That was ridiculous. At the beginning, they overreacted, and I think the lockdown was absolutely unnecessary, and the Taiwanese have shown that we needn't have done that. It was a forced recession or depression, and the only part of the country was the private sector, particularly the small business sector, that suffered, and the large number of people who were living under that. But now they're talking about getting us out of the ties with Beijing, building up our own manufacturing. But and I'll come to you in a moment because I've been talking far too much.
No, you're right, Dad.
But Graham Richardson, the Labor grandee, made a very telling remark in a piece he wrote the other day. He was talking about this need for us to revive manufacturing. It started with Hawke. They let manufacturing go. The free market prevailed and the manufacturing went where labour was cheapest and so on. And now we've seen what a terrible thing that can be for the country. We're talking about bringing back manufacturing, but Graham Richardson made the remark, even with making aluminium, smelting aluminium, where we have every advantage because the bauxite is in Australia. So next to the bauxite, we should be manufacturing the aluminium rather than sending out the bauxite and then letting somebody else refine the aluminium. Why shouldn't we be doing that? The thing is that we're closing down what aluminium smelters we have. And the reason, as Graham Richardson says, is quite simple. We don't have sufficient reliable and cheap electricity. Electricity has more than doubled in price. It's becoming more and more unreliable. And Mr. Richardson might have said the reason for that is the political class, because they're all so deranged. They're following the dictates of the Paris Agreement. And the Chinese communists are very happy to buy our coal and keep on building coal-fired stations and sell us next to useless solar panels and wind towers and so on, which do not produce cheap and reliable electricity and are driving this country into serious recession. We're going to lose all of our manufacturing. It's been going down and down. It'll go further. We'll never get it back. The Prime Minister, I'll come to you in a moment, Pete, I'm sorry. The Prime Minister, in his speech to the National Press Club, talked about revamping the union rules and cleaning up the costs of getting some qualifications. But he didn't go to the real problem. The real problem in this country is the Paris Agreement in relation to manufacturing. We'll never get it back if we don't have cheap electricity, which would be, we could fall over. It's very easy to do in this country because of our coal, and it has to be reliable electricity, which we had until the politicians stole it from us. Peter.
Yeah, they certainly did, David, just like they did to our water. They stole our water from the mum and dad farmers of Australia. Has Mr. Richardson got any ideas about how to make power cheaper, David?
Well, he didn't add that to his column. He has a lot of access to these things. I saw him on television the other night. They were talking to Matt Canavan. He and Alan Jones were talking to Matt Canavan. Matt Canavan's a senator. He was a minister, but he's changed his mind. I think it's a great thing that he has. He still defends the Paris Agreement at the time, but he says it's no longer suitable for Australia. Well, I don't think it was ever suitable for Australia. This global warming is a myth, and the idea that CO2 causes it is a myth, and renewable energy is a rort, and that's been shown in that recent film, which I can't remember the name of. But what anybody sensible knows is that global warming is not occurring. We always have climate change, and CO2 is not the cause of this.
I can't understand, David, why Scott Morrison is talking in regards to unions and all the rest of it, when, you know, at the end of the day, once our manufacturing is gone because, you know, our power bills are far too high, this is going to affect the unions. They want to wake up to it a little bit, because we won't need unions because we won't be making anything here ever again. Yes. I would really like to hear Scott Morrison say, right, as from in 3 months' time, we are going to kickstart our first manufacturing is going to be, we're going to make this, washing machines, dryers, and we're going back to making cars. And these vehicles will be used for councils, bureaucrats, politicians. Can you imagine how many vehicles would be made just supplying our local government and councils and everybody? You know, it'd be absolutely massive. And have a vehicle that actually suits the Australian climate. Don't let, you know, any other country make it for us. We can make it here our damn selves. So until Scott Morrison starts talking sense, his popularity is going to go down big time. It's going to go down as low as it was with the bushfires, the way he handled that. And this whole shutdown with this Chinese virus, and I agree with you, David, it's totally unnecessary. We had to be careful in the beginning, for sure. If we had to look what happened with the Ruby Princess there in New South Wales, the people that were let off there, I mean, the Premier and the Minister for Health let people down there. But we've got here in South Australia now, they're talking about 20 people in a room, you know, going to church, or up to 80, you know, in different rooms at the, you know, right distance apart and all the rest of it. But I mean, you can play football and tackling each other and all the rest of it. We've been going to Coles and Woolworths, and hairdressing salons open up where they're touching people. But, you know, we can't go to church. I mean, I don't go to church. I believe in God, but I don't go to church. But there's people out there. It's their way of mingling, getting some sort of peace with people that have got something in common, like-minded people. And to think that, 20 people can go to church when we've got all these thousands ever since this Chinese virus going through our supermarkets, I find this all very, very inconsistent, David. I really do. And I listened to Fauci, an interview with that Dr. Fauci in America. And he actually said a while back that these masks, this is his words, were useless. They don't do a thing. And now he's coming out saying, oh, yeah, we should be wearing them and all the rest of it. I mean, we are dealing with people that just flip-flop all over the place. And I think it's disgraceful because we're going to find it very, very difficult to recover financially from this, because I know what it was like here in South Australia with the State Bank fiasco with Tim Marcus Clark and John Bannon, now Labor Premier, who's passed away now, but years ago, and that took us that long to pay that debt, it wasn't funny. And now this debt that we've got in Australia, boy, it's horrific. It scares me. It really scares me. David.
I agree with you. We don't need to be told in detail what to do. There was a perfect world's best practice plan, which the Taiwanese had developed. The Chinese, the communist Chinese, told the World Health Organization that they weren't to listen to Taiwan. Taiwan was the country to listen to, knew exactly what to do. Our government didn't listen to them, didn't go to them, because it's so much under the influence of the communists. And it should have. And they seem to think, these politicians, they seem to think that they know better in relation to business. Now, if you look at the careers of almost all of the premiers and the Prime Minister, I think only one has been involved in business, and that was a family business which was getting into difficulty and then was sold, and he then moved into the corporation that took over the family company. But none of them, apart from that peripheral influence, none of them really have had any business experience. They've nearly all been political all their lives. They've been moving in the political areas, working as advisors and working in government jobs that they were appointed by politicians, waiting for a safe seat, getting a safe seat, and then going into Parliament. They are not experts in government. They are experts in manipulation and in doing all those things that politicians have to do to rise in politics. And they don't know terribly much about business. They seem to think that closing a business and restarting that business is like turning a light switch on and off. And as you know, Peter, it's not like that. Not like that at all. Many businesses have died as a result of what the government has done to them. Others are just struggling, and it's going to be a very tough fight. The politicians and the public servants have not suffered. They've all got the same money. They've got their regular weekly jobs, and but this has been a lockdown which has been directed just to the private sector. And it's been the essentially small business that's been the biggest sufferers in that regard, and that's intolerable. Peter.
No, you're certainly right there, David, and I can assure you, if I was in Parliament, I wouldn't have hesitated to take a 50% pay cut, and I'm sure that you would have done the same. But it just shows you that the people in there are that money hungry. It's not funny. They do the spiel and tell us how sorry they are, and the loss of jobs and all the rest. But deep down, they couldn't care less. It's only talk. No, we need some real change, David, and I do thank you very much for having these little chats. I think they're most important, and the people that I talk to are well and truly waking up. And the feedback that I'm getting is, and this wasn't right from the start, but this is now, they're saying that these premiers, they're the ones that seem to be running the show, not the federal government. The states are doing their own little thing. So the federal government's not running the show at the moment. And also they say, look, these premiers look like they're gloating at, we'll dribble 20 people can go out and mix with, you know, in a church, or, you know, up to 80 if you've got different rooms and all this. They seem to be gloating over the power and the control. And people are noticing this, David, big time.
Yes.
David.
I'll just finish on this. I was on a suburban train in Sydney today, and there were little stickers on the seats telling you where to sit on the train, which is absolutely ridiculous. If you're going to go on a train, you take a chance on that, and that's what you do. Everybody does it that way. And the idea that we're going to do this every time there's a pandemic, and there are pandemics every few years. In fact, every year there's an influenza one, and we don't seem to worry too much about that. I agree that people should be more careful in not coughing and sneezing outright. People should obviously, in their own interests, wash their hands regularly and maintain a reasonable distance without getting out a tape measure. That's what you do when there's a pandemic on. And but certainly business should continue. People should be able to work, and society should continue. We can't do this every few years. If this was the right thing to do now, it'll be the right thing to do every year, and this country will be wrecked if we do that. Well,
it's just about wrecked now, and Scott Morrison's going to have to pull a rabbit out the hat, because if he doesn't, we're in serious trouble. So on that note, David, thank you very much again. I do appreciate it, and I wish that you, on behalf of Flag Australia, wish that you were the one to do the report on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority.
I wish I were. Also wish I were doing the report on the bushfires. Not that I know anything about these, but I know who to listen to. And I'd listen to you, for example, in relation to water or fires, because you know something. I wouldn't listen to an academic who's never been on a farm and doesn't know what's going on. Peter, thank you very much. And I think to the viewers, I think that our message is Australians, take back your country.
Thank you, David.